Before Naruto Uzumaki ever dreamed of peace, the ninja world was learning how to survive genocide. The first great ninja war wasn't about flashy jutsu or chosen ones. It was about nations testing how many bodies did it take to win. This was the era where the villages, they were newborn, trust didn't exist, and shinobi stopped being warriors and became weapons of mass destruction. We only get scraps of the war in the main series and in the data books and in the fan books, but all those scraps added together, they tell a story that is far darker, far more complex, and more morally gray than anything that comes afterwards. And by the end of this newest Naruto Explained video, it becomes painfully obvious why this war, more than any other, deserves its own spinoff, or at the very least, its own OVA or movie, because the first ninja war was easily the bloodiest and most complex of the 4 ninja wars that ever took place in Naruto. So, the First Shinobi World War was Naruto's most important untold conflict. By the time that the first ninja war happened, the ninja world, it was already standing on unstable ground. Ironic given that the ninja villages were newly established. The Warring States era, it had ended. Villages were newly founded. And for the first time in history, shinobi were no longer fighting as individual clans. They're fighting as nation-backed military assets of the feudal lords of each of their lands. And that single shift, it changed everything. The first ninja war, officially known as the war that killed the first 2 generations of Kage, it was the first global conflict that involved all 5 great shinobi nations. According to Onoki, it was caused by a brutally simple reason: resources. Villages and nations began taking from one another in order to survive, in order to expand, and once that precedent was set, war truly became inevitable. One of the earliest sparks of this mindset is implied to be from Madara Uchiha in the form of a flashback, back when Madara was still a Konoha shinobi, when he demanded that the Stone Village submit to Konoha. Whether or not Madara intended it to be this way, the message was clear. In this new world, power, it dictated survival. While one can argue that Madara was going off on his own and likely did what he did behind Hashirama's back, that's no different than in our own world. If somebody goes rogue, the nation that person's from is going to be held accountable. Just like in the real world with World War I, which this war was meant to parallel, the war didn't begin because of a single villain per se. It began with competing interests, fear, and rapidly escalating militarization. You have to remember, all these powerful clans were being snatched up and formed under one umbrella. That was basically a ninjutsu arms race when you think about it. And at the forefront, you had a village like Konoha that had the Hyuga clan and the Uchiha clan, the Senju clan, and they had allies in the Uzumaki clan. Then when you add in the tailed beasts, they were basically nuclear deterrents before the ninja world itself was ready, and Konoha just happened to have the most number of them. So in the aftermath of the Madara versus Hashirama conflict, the first Hokage made what might have been the most consequential decision in shinobi history itself. At the first ever Kage summit, which the 3rd databook says that Hashirama called as an effort to try to stop the fighting, Hashirama distributed the tailed beasts to the other ninja villages. His hope was idealistic. By dividing these weapons evenly, no single village would dominate, and peace would naturally flow through balance. On paper, it worked. Smaller conflicts, they would have ended. Direct wars would have slowed. But in actuality, Hashirama just made the situation worse. He basically laid the steps forward for mutually assured destruction. Each village now possessed a walking weapon capable of leveling cities. Konoha already had its own set of bijuu at its disposal. Hashirama was handing them out, but you also had a village like the Sand Village that already had their own bijuu. As we know, these tailed beasts would fall into the hands of even smaller villages like the Hidden Waterfall Village. Instead of removing violence, Hashirama low-key just standardized all of it. When you think about it, this mirrors World War I almost perfectly. The early 20th century saw nations stockpile weapons not because they wanted war, but because they feared it being unprepared if war ever came. And once everyone was armed to the teeth, conflict became unavoidable. Hashirama's dream of peace, it didn't fail immediately, but it planted the seeds for a far bloodier future. And that future was the war that killed killed 2 generations of Kage. This is why this war really interests me, because it was a devastating scale that shows death at a level that the Naruto franchise rarely ever shows, and the fact that so much of this happened on screen, it just makes me that much more interesting. During this single conflict, the first 2 generations of Kage from every village died. Most were killed directly in combat. Hashirama's death is the only one that we know remains unknown, whether it be from sustained injuries, whether it be from some incurable illness, from something similar to Itachi's ninja aids. The key detail is this: he died at some point during this war. He named Tobirama Senju, his brother, the second Hokage, and Tobirama, he took up that mantle of Hokage during a world that was already in the process of collapsing. Tobirama attempted to continue Hashirama's pursuit of peace, but unlike his brother, he understood the reality of warfare. We saw what Tobirama did when he was Hokage. He refined the Shinobi Academy system. He remade it into what we know it as now. He came up with the ranking structures, the tactical doctrine, came up with stuff like the tuning exams, not for idealism, but instead for survival. But even then, that wasn't enough. For as much advancement as Tobirama made, he still fell short in accomplishing the peace that his brother tried. We saw during that 5 Kage summit, both of them had different ideas on how to achieve peace. Tobirama's like, if we're going to give these bijuu to the other nations, they should pay. They should have some skin in the game. Hashirama just wanted to hand them out on good faith. And you can see this even further with the failed peace treaty and how the Gold and Silver brothers were able to disrupt that. That is also another parallel to World War I. There was a attempted resolution. At some point, Konoha and the Cloud Village, 2 of the war's most powerful foes, they attempted to negotiate peace. Much like diplomatic efforts towards the end of World War I, exhaustion, it was setting in, and leaders understood the cost of continuing. But then everything fell apart in the Naruto world. The summit was ambushed by the Gold and Silver brothers, Kinkaku and Ginkaku. The second Raikage was killed. Tobirama barely escaped with his life. This moment mirrors real-world diplomatic collapses where fragile ceasefires and treaties are undone by violence, sometimes violence by rogue actors, extremism, and again, other rogue actors like the Gold and Silver brothers who are unwilling to accept peace. From here, the war only became even uglier. There was sacrifice and decoys, and this ultimately led to the death of Tobirama. As the war dragged on, the tactics themselves, they evolved. This wasn't about honorable duels anymore. Not that it ever was. This is a ninja war. You had ambushes, decoys, survival at any cost. Deception hidden behind deception. Tobirama, his death, is one of the most defining moments of the First Ninja War that everybody thinks about. Surrounded by the Kinkaku force, he chose to act as a decoy so that his subordinates could escape, but before dying, he named Hiruzen Sarutobi the third Hokage. That moment encapsulates the war perfectly. This wasn't about glory. This wasn't about victory. It was just sacrifice. Much like World War I, commanders sending soldiers into impossible situations to buy time, Tobirama's death represents the grim reality of warfare itself. Sometimes leaders die not as legends, but instead as necessary sacrifices. And you see this in other examples, like with the mutual destruction of Mu and Genjutsu Hozuki. Another haunting example of that is how you had the 2 of them battle each other and kill each other. There was no winner here. There was no territory gained. Just 2 Kage erased from history in a single clash. This mirrors almost perfectly some of World War I's most infamous battles. Massive loss of life for no meaningful strategic gain. In the aftermath, we had an armistice. We didn't necessarily have peace. Eventually, the First Shinobi World War ended, not with victory, but with that armistice, an agreement that was signed, establishing 20 years of peace. Every major village was damaged. Entire generations were lost. Combat tactics deployed. They eventually got developed during this time period of peace. Konoha, having lost multiple Hokage yet sustaining stability, emerged as the dominant superpower, much like certain other nations did after World War I. In response, we saw nations like, say, the Hidden Leaf Village erect those memorial stones that engraved the names of all the ninja who died in service, a permanent reminder that war has no true winners. universe. And just like with World War I, that peace was temporary and more names would be added to that stone over time. That's the true brilliance in my opinion. Based on all the information we have, there's a clear message that is being sent here thematically. At its core, the First Ninja War is a story about human systems evolving faster than human morality itself. The war begins not because anyone wants destruction, but because everyone fears being left behind. Villages arm themselves, they hoard resources, and they justify increasingly extreme actions in the name of balance and security. Hashirama's distribution of the tailed beast embodies this contradiction perfectly. A peaceful ideal that is implemented through instruments of mass destruction. Symbolically, it marks the moment that humanity chooses deterrence over trust itself. The war represents the death of the innocence of the shinobi world, the death of the innocent idea that peace can be found by founding the shinobi nations. The transition from a clan-based conflict to a state-sponsored war, it strips violence of honor and replaces it with efficiency. Leaders fall not as heroes, but as expendable assets to a feudal lord. Diplomacy, it can collapse under fear. Even with peace, when it comes, it's not reconciliation, it's strictly exhaustion. Much like in the real world with World War I, the First Shinobi War shows the large-scale conflict. It isn't born from evil individuals, but from systems that reward power acclamation and punish vulnerability. Symbolically, the war warns that when peace is enforced through overwhelming force rather than mutual understanding, it only delays the next catastrophe. In Naruto's world, this war is the moment the cycle of hatred becomes institutionalized, no longer personal, but instead mechanical, and it sets the calm before the storm known as the Second Ninja War. Exactly 20 years later, 14 years before Naruto's birth, the Second Shinobi World War will begin. Villages like Sunagakure struggling economically and politically in the aftermath, they began rebuilding aggressively. Much like post-World War I Germany, resentment, desperation, and ambition, it brewed beneath the surface. The stage was already set for another, even more personal war. But that story, with all of its retcons and its anime changes and hidden contradictions, it deserves its own breakdown, which will be coming soon. So we'll save the Second Ninja War for another Naruto video because there's a lot to unpack here. But in the meantime, click here on the left to check out more videos from Naruto Explained, or click here on the right to check out videos from other two anime channels where I talk about non-Naruto anime and manga.